Pluto, the planet of deep transformation, is about to spend 20 years in the sign of Aquarius. Historically, these have been revolutionary periods that resulted in dramatic shifts in perspective and the overturning of old systems. But is there a way to predict what the phases of this coming Pluto-Aquarian revolution will look like? I think there is. In the last episode, we saw how Pluto's progress through the 5 Egyptian bounds of Capricorn spoke to the major historical events that happened in that 15-year period. In this episode, we're going to apply the same kind of analysis to Pluto's last transit through Aquarius from 1777 to 1798. And then we're going to apply what we've learned and do some speculative work in imagining how Pluto's coming transit through Aquarius might play out. Now, I'm not going to explain all the theory behind this again. We covered that in my previous video, which you can find on the channel page. But we are going to need some historical background about the period we're talking about, the late 18th century. This was the period of the late Enlightenment. It was towards the end of an age of fire, a time when Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were happening in fire signs. And what we tend to see in these ages of fire, in European history at least, is the empowerment of monarchical systems of government, where power is concentrated in a single central figure, a monarch or an emperor. Why would this be? Well, the sun is very strong in the fire triplicity. And if we consider European history and look what happens during ages of fire, we see the same themes playing out over and over again. For example, in the 7th and 8th century BCE, we find the era when Rome was ruled by kings and the Greek city-states were ruled by the tyrants. This is where we get the word tyrant from. And if we fast forward 800 years to the next age of fire, we find Augustus and the first Roman emperors. And in the next one, which began with a conjunction in 769 CE, we meet Charlemagne, Charles the Great, a Frankish king who managed to reunite Europe after the Dark Ages and the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, the Age of Fire that we're concerned with today began with a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Sagittarius in 1603. And lo and behold, what began at this time is the period that historians refer to as the Age of Absolutism. It was the era of absolute rulers like Louis XIV, the Sun King, and Peter, Catherine, and Frederick the Great. Louis, of course, said "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. The solar theme is unmistakable in this period. So in the period running up to our Pluto in Aquarius transit, rule by absolute monarchies had become the norm in Europe. But what I've observed is that each elemental age contains the seeds of its own undoing. During this Age of Fire, Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and many others were beginning to suggest that there were better ways of organizing society. And so we find ourselves at the end of the 18th century. Pluto is approaching Aquarius. Now, Aquarius is one of Saturn's 2 signs. It's a fixed air sign. It has to do with technology, invention, and ideas about how society should be structured. And one theme that tends to come up repeatedly when Pluto moves into Aquarius is we see revolutionary moments in history. Remember that Aquarius opposes Leo, the sign of the sun. So Pluto-Aquarian revolutions have to do with overturning that which is at the center by those from the margins. And so at the end of this Age of Fire, with Pluto in Aquarius, we saw 2 revolutions that overturned rule by monarchies. The American colonists freed themselves from rule by the English king, and the French disposed of their monarchy altogether. Now, what we should also bear in mind is these revolutions didn't happen concurrently. The American Revolution broke out first and inspired the French Revolution. And in certain ways that we'll soon see, it caused it to happen. But in this episode, we're going to focus on Pluto's movement through the bounds. And what we'll see is how the bound ruler of the time describes what was going on either side of the Atlantic, but in quite different ways. So here are the 5 bounds of Aquarius, and you'll note that they're different sizes and appear in a different order to those of Capricorn. As with Capricorn, the first 7 degrees are Mercury's bound, but the next 6 belong to Venus, the next 7 are Jupiter's bound, then we have Mars's bound, which gets 5 degrees, and the last 5 degrees are Saturn's bound. So when Pluto moved into Aquarius for the first time on April the 4th, 1777, the American Revolutionary War was already raging. It's generally seen to have begun with the Battle of Lexington on April the 19th, 1775. At that time, Pluto was in the Mars bound of Capricorn. And that is an interesting echo of our current time, because the Ukraine war began with the Russian invasion in February 2022, with Pluto in that same Mars bound of Capricorn. Now, the American Declaration of Independence of July the 4th, 1776 also came with Pluto in that Mars bound. Mars was the warrior planet. It acts through cutting and severing, and the Americans severed themselves from the British Empire to forge a new nation. And what about France? At this time, French society was structured by what would later be called the Ancien regime, the old regime. The Ancien regime was headed by an absolute monarch, Louis XVI of the Bourbon dynasty, and society comprised three estates: the first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; and the third estate, the commoners. And in terms of rights and the burden of taxation, the commoners got a raw deal, but change was in the air. The peasantry was finding the burden of exploitation and taxation increasingly intolerable, and a new class had risen: the bourgeoisie, the merchants, manufacturers, and professionals. Many of these people had grown wealthier than the aristocracy, but they remained legally subordinate to them. They were growing dissatisfied too. So that's the political side, but we should also bear in mind that this was the era of the first industrial revolution. Manufacturing was being transformed by inventions like the steam engine and the spinning jenny. These were inventions that would shape the coming age of Earth, just as information technology is shaping our age of air. Now, if you're enjoying this content, I would really appreciate it if you just click that little like button. It really helps my channel. And if you haven't subscribed already, why don't you click that button too? And make sure you don't miss out on future episodes. So without further ado, let's look at what happened with Pluto in each of the 5 bounds of Aquarius. On April the 4th, 1777, Pluto moved into Aquarius, which put it into the first bound of the sign, Mercury's bound. And in 1778, France formally joined the American Revolutionary War. Remember that we saw last time how Mercury is associated with contesting and destabilizing. So perhaps we can see France as joining the war here as an attempt to destabilize that conflict in favor of her preferred side and against her old enemy, the British. Now, a lot of historians believe that if France hadn't joined the war, the American Revolution wouldn't have succeeded. But regardless, it came at huge cost to the French state, which spent an estimated 1.3 billion livres on the war. It was a huge amount of money, and it had serious effects on the French state's finances. Now, as we saw in the case of Donald Trump, sometimes Pluto seems to work through a single person who's influential enough to change the course of history. And here we meet a mercurial figure, Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker, who was appointed Director General of Finances for the French state on June the 29th, 1777. Now, Necker has not been seen kindly by historians. Admittedly, he had a hard job, but he attempted to finance France's involvement in the American Revolutionary War through loans rather than raising taxes. And Necker also made an unprecedented and highly Aquarian move. He released the state's accounts publicly in what was called the Compte Rendu au Roi, the report to the king. He instituted a new standard of transparency here, and he made the state's finances the business of the public, when previously it had been for the court's eyes only. But this angered the king, Louis XVI, and he dismissed Necker from his position. But crucially, in his report, Necker had grossly misrepresented the state's finances. He obscured the massive debts it had incurred from the war, and the French treasury would never recover from this. This financial catastrophe set the stage for what was to come. And you'll remember how we saw something similar when Pluto was in Capricorn's Mercury Bound in 2008. We saw a global financial meltdown, one which shaped the next 15 years. And if we think about how the world works, it's often the economy that drives political change. People who can't eat are generally much more willing to risk their lives to overthrow the system. We saw it with the Arab Spring. But with all that said, planetary archetypes can express themselves very differently at different parts of the world. So during the same period, while France's finances were disintegrating, the United States' finances were coming into being. On January the 7th, 1782, America's first commercial bank, the Bank of North America, opened, and shortly after that the US established its mint and coinage. So the themes on both sides of the Atlantic are mercurial, they're transformative, but they're very different in how they express themselves. On February the 14th, Valentine's Day 1782, Pluto reached 7 degrees of Aquarius. That put it in Venus's bound. On February the 27th, 1782, just 2 weeks later, the British Parliament voted against pursuing the American war any further. And a year later, the British formally acknowledged American independence. The American Revolution had succeeded, and this didn't go unnoticed in Europe. The message was clear: a revolt against the old system could succeed. But Venus, together with the Moon, is the planet most closely associated with food. Remember, Venus rules Taurus, a sign associated with the bounty of the harvest and material pleasures. And so, with Pluto in the Venus bound, we see another crucial event in the story of the French Revolution, the eruption for 8 months from June 1783 to February 1784 of the Laki volcano in Iceland. This eruption killed most of Iceland's livestock and devastated its agriculture. An estimated quarter of Iceland's population died due to famine, but its effects went far beyond Iceland. It cooled Europe's climate. It brought cool and rainy summers that devastated harvests for years. Scientific American put it like this: the resulting crop failures triggered one of the most famous insurrections of starving people in history, the French Revolution of 1789 to 1799. So we have a plutonic event, an eruption from the bowels of the earth that devastated the harvest, the Venusian realm, by changing the climate. Remember, Aquarius is an air sign. Now, I'd just like to interrupt the flow of the narrative to let you know that I'm currently taking bookings for private consultations. If you've been wondering what astrology might have to say about you and your life, this is your chance to find out. I use a variety of modern and traditional techniques, transits, progressions, perfections, zodiacal releasing to help my clients situate themselves in time and find answers to questions of calling and purpose. So if you're interested in booking a session, just head to my website, details in the description below, and I hope to see you soon. Okay, let's get back to it. Now, on April the 16th, 1785, Pluto reached 13 degrees of Aquarius. This put it into the bound of Jupiter. In Jupiter, we have the planet of faith, justice, high office, all those things that bring people together. And this is probably the most crucial period of Pluto's transit through Aquarius. In 1789, Congress met for the first time, the Constitution was declared to be in effect, and George Washington became the first president. But once again, this played out very differently at the other side of the Atlantic. By this time, the French state's finances had deteriorated even further. And it's here where it all falls apart for the Ancien regime. Life was getting incredibly hard for the Third Estate. The commoners, the bourgeoisie and the peasantry were bearing the brunt of taxation, but they were still legally inferior to the nobility and the clergy. And the pressure built, and it all came to a head, famously on July the 14th, 1789, when a crowd stormed the Bastille, the prison that becomes symbolic of royal tyranny. Soon after that, the revolutionaries issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, a document declaring values of liberty and democracy that would become hugely influential in the history of democracy. In 1790, that famous phrase, liberty, equality, fraternity, came into use as the rallying motto of the revolution. So to summarize, with Pluto in Jupiter's bound, the revolution expanded and cohered around Jupiterian ideals of freedom, justice, and the release from bonds. Now on March the 26th, 1790, Pluto reached 20 degrees of Aquarius. This put it into the bound of Mars, the war planet. Now what was happening in France was making European monarchs very nervous. And in 1791, the neighbouring monarchies of Austria and Prussia issued a threat to the revolutionaries of severe consequences if anything would happen to King Louis XVI. And they stationed troops on France's border. Revolutionary France responded with a declaration of war. Initially, this war was disastrous for the French. The Austro-Prussian army almost made it to Paris before they were stopped. This led to a very tense, paranoid situation. Radicals in the revolution thought they'd been betrayed by the monarchy, so they occupied the king's palace and imprisoned the royal family. And soon afterwards, a new assembly, the National Convention, abolished the monarchy and declared a republic. And it's in this period, with Pluto in the bound of Mars, that we see the emergence of a particular invention which is very closely associated with the revolution: the guillotine. It was first used in April of 1792, and in January 1793, Louis XVI was found guilty of treason and executed. 9 months later, his wife, Marie Antoinette, was guillotined too, and countless other aristocrats met the same fate. But there were different factions involved in the revolution, and around this time, a particularly radical faction, the Jacobins, took control. Among them was the infamous revolutionary Maximilien Robespierre, and the Jacobins began to push for radical social and economic policies. And of course, these radical policies met with opposition. So remember, this is a dangerous, paranoid time of war. And in response to this opposition, Robespierre launched what became known as the Reign of Terror. Some 300,000 reactionary suspects enemies of the revolution, were arrested and 17,000 of them were put on trial and executed. Many more died in prison or were simply murdered. Pluto in the bound of Mars. On March the 3rd, 1794, Pluto reached 25 degrees of Aquarius. This put it into the bound of Saturn. Now, by this time, the war with Austria had turned in France's favour, and sentiment turned against the need for the terror. And on July the 27th, 1794, Robespierre and his associates were overthrown in what became known as the Thermidorian reaction. Where did that name come from? Well, the revolutionaries had instituted a new calendar, the French Republican calendar, and the date when the revolt happened was the 9th day of the month Thermidor. Robespierre was guillotined the following day. And this period marked a much more conservative phase of the revolution. There was a real change in direction. Efforts towards greater economic equality were abandoned, and there was a wave of revenge killings against the Jacobins in what became known as the White Terror. So we have a real shift in direction here as we moved from the Mars bound to the Saturn bound. In traditional astrology, both Mars and Saturn are the malefic planets, but they aren't friends. So we've seen how, once again, as with the bounds of Capricorn, the bounds of Aquarius show us how Pluto operates. We saw distinct phases of Pluto's transit which fed into generating the conditions needed for the revolution. So the obvious question, what can we take from all this about what's coming in the 2 decades we're looking at with Pluto in Aquarius? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that Pluto's movement through the bounds doesn't on its own give us enough information to make predictions. As I've said before, we should see it as one layer among many. But what I will do now is a bit of speculation, because I know you want to hear this stuff. Pluto's transit through Aquarius will begin with its entrance into the Mercury Bound, starting March the 23rd, 2023, and it will leave that bound for the first time in late 2028. So we can expect that there'll be a mercurial flavour to the transformative effects that we see in this initial phase. So I expect that financial crisis and transformation will be part of this. And we may have already seen the beginnings of this with the recent run on Silicon Valley Bank and the bailout of depositors by the US government. As I've said before, the status of the dollar as global reserve currency could be challenged. We can also expect to see the first central bank digital currencies, and I think that move will likely invite a lot of opposition. We'll see a battle between forces of centralization and decentralization. And we've also seen how Mercury is about contesting and destabilizing. I think we can expect to see attempts to contest and destabilize the current world order, although of course we already have. One obvious possibility is new parties getting involved in the Ukraine conflict, just as France intervened in the Revolutionary War. And of course, there'll be a massive technological aspect to Pluto Aquarius. And Mercury is the planet that's associated with cleverness. And in the current context, that makes me think of AI, because what is AI but a technology that embodies cleverness itself? So I also think the story of Pluto in the bound of Mercury will also have to do with the world being reorganized in line with the opportunities and costs of the AI revolution. We should bear in mind that AI has really only just begun to change the world, and it's likely to change it in strange ways that we don't expect. One recent example, researchers in Japan have managed to combine the AI image tool Stable Diffusion with brain scans, and they've shown how they can use it to read people's minds. These are the images people were shown, and these are the images that they reconstructed using only brain scans and AI. So we really don't know what's coming with AI. It's certain to surprise us. And the other big curveball that may well be coming, something else I've talked about many times before, is the issue of UFOs. We don't know what they are, but we can be pretty sure now that they're a real phenomenon. Many people are still burying their heads in the sand about this issue, but the US government is releasing footage of these things, saying, we don't know what this is. It's getting more and more mainstream attention. Could this too be something we see with Pluto in the bound of Mercury? Mercury is the psychopomp, the messenger of the gods. Could we receive information that shifts our perspective, that proves to us that we're not the only conscious beings on this planet now? This is a wild card possibility, but it could really change the direction of history in dramatic ways. Could this be something that the incredible astrology of 2026 is pointing to? Now, after Mercury will come Venus's turn. Pluto will move through that bound from 2027 to 2032. Could we see disruption to food supplies in this time? Could we see famine? Coming from a different angle, will we see revolutionary technological developments around Venusian themes like the arts or beauty or desire. One thing that strikes me is that much more immersive virtual reality and extended reality technology is soon on the way, especially after Uranus enters Gemini in 2025. Twitter user Brian Romelli recently described a scenario that I think is worth keeping an eye on. Brian suggested that AI-generated pornography will be combined with sensors detecting certain bodily factors such as heartbeat, and porn could then be generated and optimized on the fly to stimulate the user as much as possible. Perhaps you could imagine how addictive and dangerous such a thing could be. We may well see a lot of people losing themselves in pornographic fantasy, and there may be less sinister possibilities. Perhaps we're looking at new art forms that change the world emerging at this time. Now, when Pluto enters Jupiter's bound from 2031 to 2037, this is where I suspect we may see the revolutionary developments in the political sphere. Something I've observed about the information revolution is that while it's changed our lives socially, we haven't seen states being redesigned in response to these new realities. Could we see sweeping changes to the law or new kinds of state coming into being? Pluto in the Jupiter bound of Aquarius. Now, Pluto will move into the Mars bound between 2036 and 2040. Given the history of what seems to happen when Pluto is in the Mars bounds of Saturn-ruled signs, it's hard not to be concerned about this period. 2036 is when we'll see the opposition of the Saturn-Pluto cycle that began with COVID-19 in January 2020. This is a moment I've already flagged as dangerous, particularly as it concerns US-China relations. And then from 2039 to 2044, Pluto will be in Saturn's bound, the last bound of Aquarius. Will Saturn put the brakes on whatever challenges have broken out during the Mars bound period? So that's really it for this episode. I hope you can use what I've presented here as food for thought in putting your own ideas together about what may be coming. And if you're hungry for more information about what Pluto in Aquarius might be about, I suggest you watch this episode. In this episode, I was joined by astrologer and developer Wei, aka Sadal Sood from Twitter, to consider the wild and wonderful technological world we're heading into.